Hi, today again inside cardiology, this time with digital health. This is the new way of phenotyping the patient. Whenever you see a patient, you phenotype him to understand how he is and what he might have. But now we have deep phenotyping. And of course, the traditional medicine uses the stethoscope, the ECG, maybe a little bit of blood pressure measurements every 3 weeks or every couple months. But deep phenotyping is much different. It leads to precision medicine because we should know about the parameters, the vital parameters of our patients continuously, ideally. And that, of course, is the promise. We started with home visits in patients. Then, of course, we had the outpatient visits. We now, since COVID, we learned to see patients via Zoom or Teams or whatever it is. But now we will have wearable tools around the body to supply us with all the information we need to really deep phenotype the patient. So these are all these tools. They can be, your eyes, your iris, your ears, your pulse, your rhythm, your blood pressure, your thickness of your thigh that reflect edema. So we go from a clinical examination in a trivial manner to deep phenotyping. And let's just look at one of them, which is arrhythmias. And of course there we get either an ECG or at least a pulse rhythm, and we can also use this to prevent stroke. And of course there are other applications in heart failure. These are the major ones we currently have, but eventually this will move forward. So when we actually look at this, we first have to ask, is the biological signal, is it good and is it reliable? Then of course the next question is it really an arrhythmia, for instance? So how precise is it actually? Is it specific and sensitive, or give a lot of false alarms that lead people to the emergency department for nothing? And then of course eventually, how good is the yield? How many that we monitor actually do have something? And we'll look into that. Well, first of all, let's look at the Apple Watch. And this is a large-scale assessment with a smartwatch to identify atrial fibrillation. They looked at more than 400,000 participants, received notifications in about 0.52%. So very few actually had one. And 450 participants who returned ECG patches had atrial fibrillation in a third. So it really goes down substantially. And then of course some of them actually contacted health care providers. So this is how it looks like. And when we look at atrial fibrillation, you can see on the left that age is a major determinant of the yield. As you would expect, many cardiovascular diseases are age dependent, and atrial fibrillation in particular. And you can see the percentage notified was more than 3% in those in the retirement age. It was a bit more than 1% in those in the 50s, and while in the 40s and below there was hardly any yield from this very intervention. So the other option is not to have an ECG in the proper sense, but just a pulse. This is a photoplethysmogram on the right, an PPG, and it's an optically obtained plethysmography scan that can be used to detect blood volume changes as it happens during a pulsation in the microvascular bed of tissue. And this has been done in this pragmatic trial. It's a randomized trial that in group 1 that had digital screening, and the group 2 had usual care, and then they changed around. So it was a crossover which made it really very reliable. And you can see it's about a bit more than 5,000 patients, and you can see in group 1 with digital screening the detection of atrial fibrillation requiring anticoagulation was significantly higher than in the control group. But of course, the cumulative incidence was not very high. It was about 1.5%. In phase 2, this is just the other way around. When group 1 and group 2 were switched, it's about similar, and therefore it's highly reproducible. And there's another one where you can see the numbers a bit more visually depicted. Here they screened 190,000 roughly patients. 0.2% again received the notification of suspected atrial fibrillation. And then 87% had atrial fibrillation confirmed by doctors. This one was actually quite good. And then of course 95% entered the NAVA integrated care program based on ABC and the guidelines, atrial fibrillation better care pathway. So that looks pretty good. Now when we look at it again in this, as in the Apple Watch one, we see that overall just a few had actually incident identified atrial fibrillation rate, and this was most dominant in those in the retirement age above 65, much less so 55 to 64, and really in a negligible way in the younger population. So it's really important to focus this on the elderly to detect atrial fibrillation to prevent stroke. Of course, the next thing is heart failure. Heart failure also is a condition that needs more information of the patient during everyday life. And here, of course, you can have socks that detect edema, peripheral edema, and other issues, of course, also heart rhythm and other skin patches, as well as other tools. Now, when we look at what we can do by watching patients more closely, there is a German trial, Efficacy of Telemedical Interventional Management in Patients with Heart Failure, the TIM-HF2 trial. It's randomized, controlled in parallel groups, unmasked trial. And the remote management intervention consisted of daily measurements of body weight, blood pressure, heart rate, heart rhythm analysis, oxygen saturation in the blood, and self-rated health status. And this indeed did work. The cumulative event rate was around 11% in the control group, usual care. With the intervention, there was a 30% reduction in cumulative event rates of any event in these heart failure patients. A relatively small trial with 1,500 patients roughly. But still, this seems to work, but it needs a patient that's really working with his physician. Then, of course, the next possibility is many of heart failure patients have devices implanted, be it a pacemaker, an ICD, or a CRT device, and they have remote capabilities. And in this trial by Martin Cowie from the Royal Brompton, they looked at remote management of heart failure using implantable electronic devices, and this is what they found. There was no effect whatsoever, quite disappointing. First event analysis, identical, all-cause mortality, almost identical, and unplanned hospitalizations, no difference. So this was disappointing, although it was a randomized and quite big trial. So the broad use of that in heart failure patients doesn't seem to work very well. So what do the guidelines say? The 21 ESC guidelines, they're currently updated, and we'll hear more about it next September. But what they say currently is non-invasive monitoring may be considered for patients with heart failure in order to reduce the risk of recurrent cardiovascular and heart failure hospitalizations and cardiovascular deaths. But it's more the remote monitoring of what the Germans in their trial showed us. So that's what it is. It's 2B, and the evidence level is B, so it's not very strong evidence yet, but it's there. And then, of course, we can have implantable devices. That's the real way to go for heart failure, but eventually also for blood pressure. It's ridiculous to measure blood pressure every other day or every other month. Here we have implanted also in our institution these devices that measure blood pressure in the pulmonary artery, and as you can see on the right hand side, the device is implanted just on the level of the heart, behind the heart, in a pulmonary artery or in front of the heart, and then of course continuously we can obtain systolic blood pressure in these patients in the pulmonary circulation. And this is shown here that indeed the cumulative event rate is markedly reduced with this intervention. The total change in medication has been enormous, particularly diuretics have been used more, neurohumoral antagonists and vasodilators days after the implantation have been used in a much more sophisticated and appropriate manner. There was another analysis here by Bill Abraham, who was the PI, and you can see that the treatment group on the left had less hospitalizations for heart failure, and also total hospitalizations were reduced significantly. And when you put together, as on the right panel, the admissions to hospital or death, it's the same thing, clearly a marked reduction in using this device. Now, of course, one trial is not enough, so they did another trial, the GUIDE-HF trial, also using a similar approach. And here it was clear that the primary outcome of all-cause mortality, heart failure hospitalization, and urgent heart failure visits overall was not significant because of the virus you see on the right-hand side. But what I show you here is the pre-COVID analysis. That, of course, is a sub-analysis and therefore of limited weight in terms of its evidence. But interesting, there was a clearly reduced in pre-COVID-19. The p-value was 0.007, so a significant reduction of heart failure hospitalizations in particular. So COVID, as you may expect, has destroyed many trials, including this GUIDE-HF trial, but you know, with common sense, we would say it confirms basically the champion trial, and there are less hospitalizations, and there is more appropriate use of the drugs. So, in summary, therefore, we can say that monitoring of pulmonary artery pressure using a wireless hemodynamic monitoring system may be considered in symptomatic patients with heart failure, markedly reduced ejection fraction in order to improve clinical outcomes in terms of hospitalizations, mainly with 2B and B level evidence. Depending on how we look at GUIDE-HF, maybe it's a bit stronger, and we will see what the new guidelines will bring. So clearly, digital health is on the way. It will allow us to phenotype our patients much better, to monitor them continuously. And for chronic diseases, that is the majority of cardiovascular diseases, in particular hypertension, arrhythmias, stroke prevention, and heart failure, it may be really of use. And as we improve further and get our patients even better educated, this will hopefully reduce the need for hospitalizations in those prone to it, and reduce the event rates in those with atrial fibrillation by preventing stroke early on by the use of anticoagulation in patients at risk for it. So consider that. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll see each other soon again.